The cold, metallic hum of the slave ship's engine reverberated through the narrow corridors, a low, ceaseless growl that felt like the heartbeat of some monstrous beast. Arianthea huddled in the shadows of her cell, her luminous skin casting faint, spectral light across the cold steel walls. She drew her knees to her chest, suppressing the tremor that threatened to betray her composure. Her kind had always been known for their grace and dignity, but here, in this hellish place, she was just another trophy, another rare and beautiful thing to be sold. The Celestera were creatures of wonder, known across the galaxy for their ethereal presence. Their shimmering, star-dappled skin seemed to hold the secrets of the cosmos, and their voices, soft and melodic, were said to calm even the most turbulent hearts. But beauty was as much a curse as it was a blessing. To those who saw her not as a being but as a prize, she was a fortune waiting to be claimed. Her captors were crude and brutish, a gang of slavers who thrived on the misery of others. Their leader, a hulking Crynchian named Vorath, was as calculating as he was cruel. His voice, guttural and laced with malice, echoed down the corridor as he barked orders to his crew. The traders had no need for kindness, and they wielded fear as their weapon of choice. Arianthea's cell was a narrow metal cage, its walls reinforced with dampening fields to suppress her Celesteron abilities. Though she was not physically strong, her people possessed a unique gift, an intuitive connection to the rhythms of the universe. This gift allowed them to manipulate energy in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. On her home planet of Celestara Prime, it had been a sacred skill used for healing and nurturing life. Here it was just another thing to be shackled. She pressed her palm against the smooth, icy floor, trying to center herself. It was an act of defiance as much as a survival mechanism. The traders could take her freedom, her dignity, and even her hope, but they could not take her connection to the stars. Closing her eyes, she imagined the light of her home world's twin suns warming her skin, the soft murmur of celestial winds in her ears. It was a fragile refuge, but it was hers. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her from her reverie. She opened her eyes, her pulse quickening as Vorath's shadow loomed over her cell. "Still shining, are we?" he sneered, his jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. "The bidders will like that. Makes you look untouchable, exotic. They'll pay more for that illusion." Arianthe said nothing, fixing her gaze on the floor. She had learned early that defiance only amused him, and submission made her feel small. Instead, she remained silent, her luminous eyes flickering with quiet determination. Vorath crouched, his massive frame filling the narrow corridor. "You'll fetch a fine price at the bazaar," he said, his tone sickly sweet. "The Black Star Lords will be falling over themselves to own a little Celesteran pet. And you should be grateful. I could have sold you to the pit fights instead." Her stomach churned, but she kept her expression blank. Gratitude? For this? Vorath smirked at her silence. "Don't get any ideas, Starlight. There's nowhere to run, and even if you could, there's no one out there who'd risk their neck for you." With that, he rose and sauntered away, his laughter echoing through the corridor. The other traders joined in, their coarse voices blending into a cacophony of mockery. Arianthea's hands balled into fists, her nails biting into her palms. Her captors underestimated her, dismissed her as a helpless creature. That would be their mistake. Hours, or perhaps days, blurred into one another, time was a meaningless concept aboard the ship, marked only by the trader's routines and the occasional jolt of the vessel's thrusters. Arianthea spent her time studying, observing, memorizing. She noted the shift changes, the way the guards lingered at the mess hall during meals, the pattern of the electronic locks on her cell. She had nothing but time, and she used it to plan. Her chance came when she overheard a conversation between two guards outside her cell. "Vorth's meeting some human trader at the forge outpost," one grunted, his voice thick with disdain. "Some independent spacer, probably here for parts." "Think he's looking to buy?" the other asked. "Or sell?" "Doesn't matter. Vorth'll bleed him dry, one way or another." "A human trader." The words lit a flicker of hope in her chest. Humans were unpredictable. Some were just as ruthless as the slavers, but others carried a reputation for compassion. The galaxy was vast, and Arianthea had no guarantees, but the idea of someone who might see her as more than an object was enough to spark a desperate plan. The forge outpost was a decaying relic of an ancient mining colony orbiting a dying star. Its once grand halls were now a haven for smugglers, mercenaries, and traders willing to deal in the illicit and the forbidden. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay, the dim lighting casting long shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. The Vorath ship docked with a bone-rattling hiss, its gangplank extending into the station's main atrium. Arianthea was dragged from her cell, her shackles cold against her wrists and ankles. The traders surrounded her like a pack of predators, their eyes gleaming with greed as they paraded her through the outpost. The crowd parted as Vorth approached the meeting point. Standing there, amid the chaos, was the human trader. Alias Vane was unremarkable at first glance. Dressed in a simple leather jacket and cargo pants, his face shadowed by a weathered cap. But there was something in his eyes, sharp, piercing and unflinching, that set him apart from the rough crowd around him. He stood with an air of quiet confidence, as though he had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer, and survived. Vorth's grin widened as he approached. "Captain Vane," he drawled, spreading his arms theatrically. "Welcome to the finest collection of wares this side of the sector." Elias's gaze swept over the group, lingering briefly on Arianthea. She felt the weight of his scrutiny, but instead of the hunger or apathy she had grown used to, there was something else in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or hesitation. "I'm not here for wares," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here for parts, ship repairs." "Houts, wares, it's all trade, isn't it?" Vorth's tone was oily, his smile predatory. "Perhaps you'd reconsider. This one here," he gestured to Arianthea with a flourish, "is a once-in-a-lifetime find." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested." Her luminous eyes were fixed on Elias. She had gambled everything by speaking out, by breaking her silence and daring to plead for help. And now, as she stood shackled in the center of the market, her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat a reminder of how much she had to lose. Vorath broke the silence first, his jagged grin stretching wide across his face. "Changed your mind, have you, Captain? Smart man. I knew you'd see her worth." Elias's expression was unreadable. His weathered cap cast a shadow over his sharp features, but his piercing eyes, an unsettling mix of steel and storm, were fixed on Arianthea. There was no pity in his gaze, but neither was there cruelty. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see beyond her radiant skin and into the very core of her being. "I'm not buying her," Elias said at last, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I don't deal in slaves." The declaration hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed the entire bazaar had gone silent. Vorath's grin faltered, his face darkening like a storm cloud. "No?" Vorath said, his voice a low growl. "Then what exactly are you doing wasting my time?" Elias's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smirk. "Call it curiosity. You said she was a once-in-a-lifetime find. I wanted to see if you were exaggerating." Bharat's laughter was a jagged bark, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, she's the real deal, all right. Celasteran, practically extinct. And this one's got fight in her, too. Makes her even more valuable. If you've got any sense, you'll reconsider. I guarantee a creature like this can fetch you more than you'd make in 10 years of trading." Arianthea felt her stomach turn. She wasn't a creature, a commodity to be bartered and sold. She was Arianthea of Celestera, and she would not let them strip her of her identity, no matter how dire her situation. "Help me," she said again, her voice steadier this time. Her gaze remained locked on Elias, ignoring Vorath's predatory grin and the leering crowd around them. "Not because you see my value, but because you can, because you have a choice." Elias's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been compassion. He shifted his weight, his hand brushing against the holster at his side, and then he spoke. "You said you had parts for sale," he said, addressing Vorath but keeping his eyes on Arianthea. "I need components for my ship. If you've got what I'm looking for, maybe we can talk about a trade." Vorath's expression twisted into a sneer. "Oh, we've got parts all right, but they don't come cheap. And I'm not throwing her in as a bonus, if that's what you're thinking." "Didn't say you had to," Elias replied coolly, "but if you want my business, you'll let her come with me." The crowd murmured, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the square. Vorath's eyes narrowed, his amusement replaced by suspicion. "You think you can walk out of here with her for free? You've got a lot of nerve, Captain." Elias took a step closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Vorath and Arianthea could hear. "I think you know what happens if you try to stop me. You've got a reputation, Vorath, but so do I. And unlike you, I don't make my living off terrified prisoners." Vorath's hand twitched, hovering near the weapon at his belt. Arianthea held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. If Vorath decided to fight, there would be no escape, no chance for freedom. But then the slaver let out a harsh laugh, stepping back and spreading his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "Take her. But if you think this is over, you're more of a fool than I thought." Elias didn't reply. He simply nodded toward Arianthea, motioning for her to follow. One of Vorath's underlings unlocked her shackles, and for the first time in weeks she felt the weight of the restraints fall away. Her wrists ached, but she ignored the pain, focusing instead on the man who had just risked his life to give her a chance at freedom. "Let's go," Elias said, his voice brisk. He turned and began weaving through the crowd, his movements efficient and unhurried. Arianthea hesitated for only a moment before hurrying after him, her steps light and silent despite the chaos around them. The journey back to Elias's ship, the Starfire, was a blur. Arianthea kept her head down, her glowing skin hidden beneath the folds of a borrowed cloak. She could feel eyes on her as they moved through the crowded corridors of the Forge outpost, but Elias's presence was a shield, his confident stride warning anyone who might have considered interfering. The Starfire was docked in a quieter section of the outpost, its sleek utilitarian design a stark contrast to the garish and heavily armed vessels surrounding it. Elias keyed in a code, and the ship's ramp descended with a hiss. He gestured for her to enter, following close behind as the doors sealed shut behind them. Inside, the ship was modest but well-maintained. The walls were lined with panels that hummed softly, and the air smelled faintly of oil and metal. It was a functional space, built for efficiency rather than comfort, but, to Arianthea, it felt like a sanctuary. Elias turned to her, his arms crossed. "You've got a name?" She hesitated. "Arianthea." He nodded. "You're Celeste Ran." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes." There was a pause, and then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't know what you've been through, but you're safe now. For the moment, anyway." She tilted her head, studying him. "Why did you help me?" His eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time she saw the weight he carried, a weariness born of countless battles, of choices that left scars. Because someone had to. The simplicity of his answer caught her off guard. It wasn't heroism or altruism that had driven him, but something more personal, more raw. Before she could respond, the ship's console chimed, and Elias moved to the cockpit, muttering under his breath. Arianthea followed, her footsteps soft. As she stepped into the cockpit, the stars filled her vision, vast and infinite. She had always found solace in their light, and now, as the Starfire prepared to launch, she felt a spark of something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Elias's voice broke the silence. "You should get some rest. We've got a long journey ahead, and something tells me Vorath won't let this slide." She nodded, retreating to the small quarters he had pointed out. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the weight of her exhaustion. Curling up on the narrow cot, she stared out the small window at the stars beyond, their light a reminder of her resilience. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing: she would fight for her freedom no matter the cost. And now she had someone willing to fight alongside her. For the first time in weeks, Arianthea closed her eyes and let herself dream. The Starfire hummed softly as it drifted through the void, a small vessel in the vast expanse of uncharted space. The galaxy stretched endlessly before them, a kaleidoscope of stars, nebulae, and celestial phenomena that glimmered against the black canvas of the universe. It was a beauty both haunting and awe-inspiring, but for Arianthea, it was also a reminder of how far she was from home, and how uncertain her future remained. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her luminous skin dimmed beneath the folds of a borrowed jacket, which hung awkwardly on her slender frame. Though the cockpit was small and utilitarian, Elias Vane had made it functional, with neatly organized tools and a worn chair that bore the unmistakable imprint of long hours spent navigating the stars. Beside her, Elias adjusted the ship's trajectory with practiced ease, his hands moving over the controls with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy but not oppressive, a fragile truce between two strangers bound by circumstance. It gave Arianthea time to observe the man who had, against all odds, risked his life to save her. Elias was an enigma. His face, rugged and lined with faint scars, bore the marks of someone who had seen too much, survived too much. His storm-gray eyes, though sharp and alert, carried a weight that Arianthea recognized all too well, a burden of loss and regret, And yet, there was a quiet determination in his every movement, an unspoken resolve that intrigued her as much as it reassured her. Finally, she broke the silence. "You're different from the others." He glanced at her, one brow raised. "The others?" "The traders, the slavers. Most people in places like the Forge Outpost don't care about doing what's right. They only care about what they can gain." Elias smirked faintly, his eyes flicking back to the console. "Don't mistake me for a saint. I'm not in the habit of sticking my neck out for strangers." "Then why did you?" His hand stilled on the controls, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond the cockpit. "Let's just say I've seen enough people get chewed up by this galaxy," he said quietly. "Didn't want to see it happen to you." Arianthea studied him, her luminous eyes searching for the truth beneath his words. There was more to his answer, she was certain, but she didn't press him. Instead, she turned her gaze to the viewport, where a distant nebula shimmered like a cosmic storm of color and light. "What about you?" Elias asked after a while. "What's your story?" She hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of her seat. "I was taken from my homeworld, Celestara Prime." He nodded. "I figured as much. You don't exactly blend in." Oh. A faint smile tugged at her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "No, my people, we're different. The universe sees us as rare and beautiful, but that only makes us targets. There aren't many of us left." Elias frowned, his hands tightening on the controls. "I've heard stories about Celestarans, about what your people can do." "Our connection to the stars," she said softly. "It's not magic, though many think it is. We call it the harmony. A way of sensing and attuning to the natural energy of the universe. On my world, it was sacred. We used it to heal, to create, to sustain life. But to slavers, it's just another commodity to exploit." Elias's jaw clenched, and Arianthea could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. It wasn't directed at her, but at the cruelty of the galaxy itself. She appreciated it more than she could say. The silence returned, but this time it was interrupted by a sudden, insistent beeping from the ship's console. Elias leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied the readings. "Trouble?" Arianthea asked, her voice tense. "Need yet," he replied, though his tone didn't inspire confidence. "We've got a ship trailing us, too far back to identify, but it's closing in." Her stomach twisted. "Vorat?" "Probably. He's not the type to let a grudge go." Elias reached for the comm system, scanning for nearby signals. "We're too far from any safe ports, and I'm not risking a direct confrontation. There's a nebula up ahead, dense enough to mask our signal, but it's a rough ride." Ariantha glanced at the swirling mass of color and light that loomed on the viewport. The nebula was beautiful, its hues shifting like a living painting, but she could feel the turbulence emanating from it, even from this distance. It was a storm, both in appearance and in essence, and navigating it would be dangerous. "Can we make it through?" she asked. Elias's smirk returned, though it was tinged with grim determination. "We don't have much of a choice. Hold on." The starfire plunged into the nebula, and the cockpit was immediately bathed in a kaleidoscope of light. The ship shuddered violently as waves of energy buffeted its hull, and the air filled with the hum of straining engines. Arianthea gripped the edges of her seat, her heart racing as the turbulence threatened to tear the vessel apart. Elias, however, was unflinching. His hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, adjusting the thrusters and stabilizers to counteract the chaotic forces around them. His focus was absolute, his movements fluid and efficient, as though he had done this 100 times before. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Arianthea managed to say, her voice strained. Elias shot her a quick grin. "What gave it away?" She couldn't help but smile despite the chaos. For all his gruffness, Elias had a certain charm, a spark of humor and defiance that reminded her of the strength she was trying to reclaim. But their reprieve was short-lived. The sensors beeped again, signaling the approach of another ship. "They're following us," Elias said, his grin fading. "Vorath's crew must be running interference dampeners to keep their signal masked." Arianthea's mind raced. She had spent her captivity observing, memorizing, learning. Now those instincts kicked in. "The harmony," she said suddenly. "I can use it to disrupt their systems." Elias gave her a sharp look. "I thought the harmony didn't work against tech." It doesn't. Not directly, but the nebula's energy is chaotic, unbalanced. If I can amplify the interference patterns, it might scramble their sensors long enough for us to escape." He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Do it." Arianthea closed her eyes, reaching out with the part of herself she had long suppressed. The harmony was faint here, buried beneath the turbulence of the nebula, but it was there. A rhythm, a pulse, a song. She attuned herself to it, letting its energy flow through her, and then she pushed. The ship vibrated, the air crackling with unseen energy. Elias glanced at the console, his eyes widening as the readings spiked. "Whatever you're doing," he said, "it's working." The pursuing ship faltered, its trajectory veering wildly as its systems failed. Elias seized the opportunity, engaging the thrusters and propelling the Starfire out of the nebula and into open space. When they finally emerged, the pursuing ship was nowhere to be seen. The nebula's swirling mass loomed behind them, a barrier that had swallowed their enemies whole. Arianthea slumped back in her seat, her body trembling with exhaustion. The harmony had taken its toll, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of triumph. Elias looked at her, his expression a mix of respect and curiosity. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" She managed a weak smile. "You have no idea." As the Starfire sailed into the vastness of space, Arianthea allowed herself to breathe, to hope. She was no longer just a captive, a victim of cruel fate. She was a fighter, and she was free, if only for now. The Black Star Bazaar was a place of nightmares wrapped in neon allure. Its sprawling corridors wove through the hollowed-out remains of a colossal asteroid, where illegal markets thrived in defiance of galactic law. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of strange spices, engine grease, and the bitter tang of desperation. Neon signs flickered and buzzed, casting jagged shadows over the throngs of beings that filled the chaotic market square. Arianthea stood at the edge of a platform overlooking the bazaar, her fingers brushing the edge of the borrowed cloak that shielded her radiant skin from prying eyes. Her heart hammered in her chest as she scanned the crowd below. Each step into the bazaar felt like a leap into a pit of vipers, and yet she couldn't turn back. Not now. "This place," Elias muttered beside her, his voice low and taut, "is a cesspool." She glanced at him. Even in the dim light, his eyes were sharp, scanning their surroundings with a practiced vigilance. He wore a worn jacket that blended in with the rough crowd, but there was something about the way he carried himself, steady, unyielding, that set him apart. "And yet," she replied softly, "it's exactly where we need to be." The Starfire had made it to the bazaar after days of careful navigation through uncharted territory. Vurath's relentless pursuit had forced them to take longer, more dangerous routes, but now they were here, and the slaver's wrath was close behind. Arianthea had insisted on coming to the bazaar despite Elias's protests, determined to recover something stolen from her during her captivity, a small ancient artifact from Celestara Prime, known as the Astral Resonance. It was said to hold the collective memory of her people, a beacon of hope for a scattered and broken species. Elias had argued against the plan. "You're already a target," he had said, his voice laced with frustration. "Walking into the lion's den is suicide." But Arianthea's resolve had been unshakable. "That artifact is all I have left of my people. If we run now, it'll be lost forever." In the end, Elias had relented, though not without making it clear that he thought the idea was reckless. Now, as they prepared to descend into the belly of the bazaar, Arianthea wondered if he was right. "Stay close," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If anything feels off, we're out of here. Understood?" She nodded, pulling the hood of her cloak lower. Together they descended into the labyrinthine depths of the bazaar. The crowds pressed in from all sides, a dizzying swirl of species from every corner of the galaxy. Vendors shouted over one another, hawking wares ranging from rare alien flora to black market weaponry. Arianthea's senses were overwhelmed by the cacophony of sounds, the riot of colors and smells. She kept her head down, her focus on Elias's steady presence ahead of her. They made their way toward the market's central hub, a sprawling atrium where the most powerful traders conducted their business. The air was thick with tension, a volatile mix of greed and danger. Arianthea's skin prickled as she felt the weight of countless eyes on her, though she couldn't tell if they were real or imagined. "There," she whispered, nodding toward a raised platform on the far side of the atrium. Atop it sat a glass display case, within which rested the Astral Resonance. Its crystalline structure refracted the neon light, casting faint, shimmering patterns on the walls around it. Elias followed her gaze, his expression grim. "They've got it locked up tight. Getting to it won't be easy." "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice firm. "That's our goal." Before Elias could respond, a low, rumbling laugh echoed from behind them. Arianthea froze, her blood turning to ice as she recognized the voice. "Well, well," Vurath said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Look who decided to come back." They turned to find the Crinchian slaver standing a few meters away, flanked by a dozen heavily armed guards. His grin was wide and cruel, his eyes glinting with malice as he took in the sight of Arianthea and Elias. "Did you really think you could steal from me and get away with it?" Vurath sneered. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but this is where it ends." Elias's hand dropped to the blaster at his hip. "We're not looking for trouble, Vurath. Walk away." Vurath's laughter was a harsh bark. "Trouble? You think you can waltz into my territory, steal my prize, and not face the consequences? No, Captain. The only thing you'll be walking away with is regret." The crowd around them began to disperse, sensing the imminent confrontation. Arianthea's heart raced as she scanned the area, searching for an escape route. But Vurath's men had them boxed in, their weapons trained on the pair. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Arianthea and the slavers. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down her spine. "You want her? You'll have to go through me." Vorath's grin widened. "Gladly." The first shot rang out, splitting the air like thunder. Elias moved with blinding speed, his blaster drawn and firing before the slavers could react. Arianthea ducked behind a stall, her breath coming in short gasps as chaos erupted around her. The bazaar became a battlefield, the sharp crack of energy weapons mingling with the screams of panicked bystanders. Elias fought with a precision born of experience, his movements fluid and deliberate. He ducked, rolled, and fired, taking down Vorath's guards with ruthless efficiency. But the slavers were many, and the odds were stacked against them. Arianthea clenched her fists, her mind racing. She couldn't just hide while Elias fought for their lives. Closing her eyes, she reached out with the harmony, feeling for the subtle rhythms of the universe. The bazaar was chaotic, its energy fractured and discordant, but she found a thread of order within it, a pulse she could manipulate. Focusing her will, she directed a wave of energy toward one of the slavers' weapons. It shorted out with a crackling burst, the guard yelping in surprise as he dropped it. Encouraged, Arianthea continued, disrupting their systems one by one. "Nice work!" Elias shouted over the din, a rare grin flashing across his face. "Keep it up," said someone next to him. But their luck couldn't last forever. Vorath himself joined the fray, his massive frame barreling toward them with terrifying speed. He swung a heavy, electrified baton, forcing Elias to block with his blaster. The impact sent him stumbling back, and Vorath pressed the advantage, his attacks relentless. Arianthea felt a surge of desperation. She reached out with harmony again, this time directing it at Vorath. The energy rippled through the air, but he shrugged it off with a snarl, his Crynchian physiology resistant to her influence. Elias was on the defensive, his movements growing slower as Vorath's blows rained down. Arianthea couldn't let it end like this. Summoning every ounce of courage, she rushed forward, her hand outstretched. She touched Vorath's arm, channeling a burst of energy directly into his nervous system. The effect was immediate. Vorath roared in pain, his body convulsing as the energy overwhelmed him. Elias seized the opportunity, delivering a swift kick to the slaver's chest that sent him crashing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Elias turned to Arianthea. "You okay?" She nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "I'm fine." He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The touch was brief, but it sent a warmth through her that steadied her trembling nerves. His voice softened. "You did good." For a moment, they stood there amid the wreckage, the chaos of the bazaar fading into the background. It was a small, fragile victory, but it was theirs. "We need to go," Elias said, his hand lingering a moment longer before dropping to his side. "Before reinforcements show up." Together they retrieved the astral resonance and slipped away into the shadows. Arianthea clutched the artifact tightly to her chest, its familiar warmth a reminder of what they had fought for. As they boarded the Starfire and left the bazaar behind, she felt a new sense of resolve. She wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, she dared to believe in a future beyond survival. And as Elia's hand briefly brushed hers while setting the course, she realized that perhaps in this vast and dangerous galaxy, she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for, a connection, fragile but real, that gave her strength to keep fighting. The Starfire streaked through the void, its engines thrumming with determined vigor as it cut across the endless expanse of space. Behind it, the Black Star Bazaar shrank into a distant speck, and with it, the immediate threat of Vorith and his slavers. But Arianthea and Elias both knew the danger was far from over. The galaxy was vast, but Vorith's reach extended far, and his wrath was not something to be easily escaped. In the cockpit, Arianthea sat in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers brushing the edges of the artifact, now safely in her possession. The astral resonance was smaller than she remembered, its crystal resonance glowing faintly in the dim light. Despite its fragile appearance, it was a beacon of resilience, a symbol of her people's enduring spirit. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface, feeling the faint pulse of energy within, as though the artifact itself were alive. "Still in one piece?" She glanced at him. He was at the controls, his expression one of focused calm, though his eyes carried a trace of exhaustion. A deep cut ran along his jawline, the result of their skirmish at the bazaar. She had offered to treat it, but he had waved her off, claiming it was just a scratch. Now, as the faint glow of the stars illuminated his features, she noticed the tension in his posture, the weight he carried in his shoulders. "Yes," she said softly, "it's safe." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the console. "Good. That's one less thing to worry about." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the ship, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the fragile calm between them. But Arianthea's mind was far from quiet. The events of the past hours played over and over, a whirlwind of chaos and courage, of fear and triumph. She had fought back against the slavers, reclaimed a piece of her heritage, and, perhaps most surprisingly, found herself placing her trust in someone who was still very much a stranger. "I need to ask you something," she said, breaking the silence. Elias turned to her, one eyebrow raised. "Go on." "What? Did you stay?" She met his gaze, her luminous eyes searching his. "After everything at the bazaar, you could have walked away. You didn't owe me anything." He leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening as he considered her question. "I told you before," he said, his voice low. "I've seen what this galaxy does to people like you. I wasn't about to let Vorith get his hands on you again." "But it's more than that, isn't it?" she pressed gently. "You've been running too, from something, or someone." Aaliyah's eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as if under the weight of an invisible burden. "I used to run with a crew," he said finally, "a good crew. We took jobs on the edge of the law, smuggling, salvage runs, the kind of work that paid enough to keep us flying. But one day we crossed the wrong people. I made a call that got half my crew killed, the rest scattered. I've been on my own ever since." Arianthea's chest tightened. She could hear the guilt in his voice, the way it clung to him like a shadow. "You blame yourself." He gave a bitter laugh. "Of course I do. It was my call, my mistake." She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The gesture was instinctive, a quiet offering of comfort. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "But carrying that weight alone won't bring them back. It won't change the past." Elias glanced at her, his expression softening. For a moment, the walls he had built around himself seemed to crack, letting her glimpse the man behind the stoic mask. "You've been through hell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you keep going?" She looked down at the astral resonance in her lap. "Because I have to. My people are scattered, broken. If I give up, who will fight for them? Who will remember what we stood for?" The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain and resilience that bound them together. The moment was interrupted by a sharp, insistent beeping from the console. Elias straightened, his hands moving to the controls as a warning flashed across the screen. "Incoming ship," he said grimly. "Looks like Vorath's not done with us yet." Arianthea's stomach dropped. How did he find us so quickly? Elias's jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter, he's here now." The ship's proximity sensors lit up, revealing a massive vessel closing in fast. It was one of Vorath's, bristling with weapons and flanked by smaller, more agile fighters. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and escape seemed impossible. Elias turned to her, his expression serious. "Get to the engine room. If we're going to make it out of this, I'll need you to keep the ship's power steady." She hesitated, her fear threatening to root her in place. But then she saw the determination in his eyes, the unshakable resolve that had carried them this far. She nodded, clutching the astral resonance tightly before hurrying toward the engine room. The battle that followed was chaos. The Starfire weaved through a storm of enemy fire, its shields straining under the relentless assault. Elias was a master at the controls, his hands flying over the console as he maneuvered the ship with breathtaking skill. But even he couldn't hold them off forever. In the engine room, Arianthea worked frantically to stabilize the ship's power. The harmony flowed through her, guiding her hands as she rerouted energy and repaired damaged circuits. The ship was an extension of her will, its rhythm aligning with hers in a delicate dance. "We've got a problem," Elias's voice crackled over the comm. "They've locked onto us with a tractor beam. If we don't break free now, we're done." Arianthe's mind raced. She reached out with the harmony, her senses brushing against the energy signature of the enemy ship. It was powerful, but it had a weakness, a fault in the beam's stabilizer. If she could disrupt it, even for a moment, they might have a chance. Closing her eyes, she focused all her energy on the stabilizer. The harmony thrummed through her, building in intensity until it burst forth in a wave of concentrated force. The beam flickered, then shattered. "We're free!" Elias shouted. "Hang on!" The Starfire surged forward, its engines roaring as it left the enemy ships behind. Arianthea collapsed against the console, her body trembling from the effort. But they had done it. They had escaped. In the aftermath, the ship was quiet. Arianthea returned to the cockpit, her steps unsteady, but her heart light. Elias was slumped in his seat, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. When he saw her, he managed a faint smile. "You did it," he said, his voice rough but warm. "So did you," she replied, sinking into the co-pilot's seat. For a moment they simply sat there, the stars stretching endlessly before them. Then, without thinking, Arianthea reached out and took his hand in hers. His fingers were rough and calloused, a stark contrast to her own, but the gesture felt right, natural. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "For everything." Elias's hand tightened around hers, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had forged. "We're not done yet," he said, his tone lighter, "but we'll get there." Together they sat in the cockpit, their hands intertwined, as the Starfire sailed into the unknown. In that moment, the vastness of the galaxy didn't feel so lonely anymore.